The diner smelled of burnt coffee and cigarette smoke, the kind of place where the booths had duct tape over the cracks and the clock on the wall ran 5 minutes slow. It was the summer of 1953, and the desert heat of Tucson, Arizona, had driven every kind of man inside, seeking refuge from the relentless sun. At the counter, a young woman in a pale blue uniform moved carefully between tables, her swollen belly pressing against her apron strings, her feet aching against the cracked linoleum floor. And then it happened loud enough for every soul in that diner to hear. Something so cruel, so deliberately humiliating, that the entire room went breathlessly still. What no one knew was that the man sitting alone in the corner booth had seen every single second of it, and he was already standing up. Her name was Clara Dobbins, and she had turned 23 years old 3 weeks before that summer afternoon, though she told no one about her birthday because there was simply no one left to tell. She had grown up in the red dust country outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico, the daughter of a railroad man and a mother who had worked 3 jobs simultaneously for most of Clara's childhood. From a very early age, Clara understood that dignity was not something the world handed to you freely. It was something you carried with you carefully, the way you carry a glass filled too close to the rim, always moving, always watching, terrified of the moment it might finally spill. She had married Thomas Dobbins in the spring of 1951, a quiet and good-humoured man who fixed truck engines at a garage on the edge of town and brought her wildflowers picked from the roadside on his way home from work every Friday evening. Thomas was the kind of man who laughed easily, apologised quickly, and never once made Clara feel small or forgotten. By the fall of that same year, Clara was carrying their first child together, and the two of them spent warm evenings on the porch of their small rented house talking about names, about futures, about what kind of world they were bringing a new life into. Thomas Dobbins died in December of 1951 on a stretch of icy highway outside Flagstaff. A truck with a failed brake line jackknifed violently across 2 lanes, and Thomas, driving home from a routine parts run, never had a single moment to react. Clara received the news standing in her kitchen, still wearing her apron from her afternoon waitress shift. She lost the baby 6 weeks later. The grief that settled over her after those 2 losses was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet and vast, the kind that lives in the chest like a stone you stop noticing only because you can no longer remember what breathing without weight once felt like. By the time she found herself working the lunch shift at the Rio Grande Diner on Speedway Boulevard in Tucson in the summer of 1953, Clara was pregnant again. The father of the child was a man who had quietly left Tucson before she could finish telling him the news. She had no family nearby, no savings to speak of, and a landlord whose patience was wearing thinner with each passing week. But she worked. She rose before sunrise every morning, pulled on her pale blue uniform, laced her swollen feet into her worn shoes. And she worked because that was what she knew how to do, because Thomas would have expected nothing less of her, and because the small life growing inside her deserved a mother who did not surrender easily. She never asked for sympathy from customers. She never made her circumstances anyone else's burden. She carried her glass carefully, as she always had. What she could not have prepared for was the casual cruelty of strangers, the way 2 men in expensive shirts at table 7 would look at a visibly pregnant, visibly exhausted young woman doing her absolute best, and decide that this Tuesday afternoon was the perfect moment to tear her apart in front of everyone present. The taller man called Clara back to the table for the 3rd time in 20 minutes, his voice rising deliberately above the noise of the diner, theatrical and cold. He said her service was pathetic. He said she had no business being on her feet in that condition. Each sentence landed sharper than the last. The entire diner went silent, and in that silence, something unbearable was happening to a woman who had already survived more than most people in that room could imagine. The man in the corner booth had been watching since the moment Clara first approached table 7. He had arrived roughly 40 minutes earlier, sliding into the far corner seat with the particular ease of a man long accustomed to fitting himself into ordinary spaces without drawing unnecessary attention. He was large, not softly large, but in the way of a man whose frame had been shaped by decades of physical presence, of horses and open country and pre-dawn mornings that demanded something real from the body. He wore a plain cotton shirt, pale tan, sleeves rolled to just below the elbow. His hat sat on the seat beside him, a battered working hat, not a costume piece, not a prop. He had ordered black coffee and a slice of apple pie, and had eaten without urgency, glancing occasionally through the window at the white-blazed street outside. He was not a man who drew attention to himself in the private moments of his days, and those few in the diner who had quietly recognized him seemed to understand instinctively that the correct response was to allow him his peace. Dottie, the veteran waitress who had taken his order, had given him a single knowing nod and said nothing to the other staff. A 17-year-old busboy named Ernesto Vega had looked up once, gone very still, and then returned his gaze carefully to the floor tiles. But this man was not reading. He was not lost in private thought. He was watching Table 7 with a quality of stillness that was entirely different from the uncomfortable silence filling the rest of the diner. The others had gone quiet out of that familiar cowardice, the instinct to disappear into the furniture when something ugly erupts nearby. His stillness was different. It was the stillness of a man in the final moments of making a decision. When the businessman raised his voice for the second time, and his companion laughed at the precise moment designed to cause maximum damage, the man in the corner booth set his coffee cup down with slow, deliberate care. He placed both hands flat against the table. He rose to his full height, and he began walking across that linoleum floor, and somehow, impossibly, each footstep seemed to fill the entire silence of the room. John Wayne, born Marion Robert Morrison in Winterset, Iowa, and by the summer of 1953, one of the most recognized men on the face of the earth, pulled out the empty chair directly across from the businessman from Phoenix and sat down without asking permission. He did not announce himself. He did not raise his voice. He settled into that chair with the slow, inevitable weight of a man who has decided precisely where he needs to be and sees no reason to apologize for it. The businessman looked up. Whatever sharp sentence he had been preparing evaporated instantly. His companion went rigid beside him. The table fell completely silent, and the silence spread outward through the diner like a ripple across still water, until every person in the room was oriented, without quite meaning to be, toward that single corner. Wayne placed one forearm on the table and looked directly at the man who had been speaking not with performed menace, not with theatrical anger, but with the calm, level gaze of a man who has decided to be entirely honest and finds nothing complicated about it. He spoke quietly enough that the rest of the diner strained forward to catch any fragment of it. He said that the young lady had been conducting herself with more grace than either man at this table had managed to deserve, and that he would personally consider it a kindness if they found it within themselves to treat her as such going forward. He said it without decoration, without theatre, the way you state something so plainly true that dressing it up would be an insult to the truth itself. Then he reached into his breast pocket, opened his wallet without ceremony, and placed enough money on the table to cover not merely his own bill, but every outstanding check in the diner at that moment. He smoothed the bills flat with one hand beside the salt shaker, and then he turned to Clara, who had taken one small step back from the table and was standing with one hand resting gently on her abdomen, a gesture so instinctive and quietly protective that multiple witnesses would later say it was that single detail more than anything else that broke something open inside them. Wayne looked at her with a regard that carried no pity and no performance, only recognition. He said her service had been excellent. He said it loudly enough that time for the entire room to hear clearly. Dottie, behind the counter, began to applaud first. She was not the last. The two men at table 7 left within minutes without finishing their meals, without making eye contact with a single soul, without producing one syllable between them. The door swung shut, and the diner exhaled all at once, a breath that had been held far too tightly for far too long. Word moved through Tucson the way word moves through a city when a story carries genuine weight quickly, and with the specific electricity that attaches to moments people instinctively recognize as meaningful. By that evening, regulars at the Rio Grande counter were recounting every detail to anyone willing to listen. By the following morning, the story had reached Paul Greer, a careful reporter at the Arizona Daily Star, who spent 2 full days verifying before writing a single word. Dottie confirmed it, 2 other customers confirmed it, Ernesto Vega confirmed it with barely contained excitement. What kept surfacing in every retelling was never the money, it was never the fame. It was the specific quality of Wayne's attention, the way he had looked at Clara Dobbins, not as a woman requiring rescue, not as a cause to be championed publicly, but simply as a person whose dignity had been interfered with and needed only to be restored. There was no audience being played to, no moment being manufactured. Ernesto Vega would speak about that afternoon for the rest of his life, saying that watching a man of that stature stand up from a corner booth and walk across a diner to quietly tell 2 wealthy men that a pregnant waitress deserved basic human respect had permanently rearranged something in the way he understood what it meant to be a decent person in the world. The story might have ended in the exhale of that diner, in the settling of an extraordinary afternoon back into the rhythm of an ordinary one. But there is one moment the accounts of that day return to consistently, a moment that happened not on the loud geography of the diner floor, but in the narrow strip of shade along the building's eastern wall, in the 3 minutes before John Wayne drove away. Clara had slipped out the side door during the brief commotion of the aftermath, needing air, needing space for the trembling in her hands to subside where no one could observe it. She was standing with one palm pressed against the warm brick when Wayne came round the corner, heading toward his car parked along the side street. He nearly walked past her. He stopped. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. The desert wind moved briefly between them, carrying the dry smell of Tucson in summer heat and dust, and the distant sound of traffic from Speedway Boulevard. She told him quietly that she was all right. It was not entirely true, and both of them understood that, and the understanding passed between them without either needing to speak it directly. Wayne looked at her with that same regard, no pity, only recognition, and said, simply, "You were already handling it." He touched the brim of his hat, turned and walked to his car. 5 words, turned over by everyone who heard this story since. What those words managed to say, all at once, was that he had seen her composure before he ever saw her humiliation. That what he had done was not a rescue, but a reinforcement, the act of a man who looked at a woman holding herself together with everything she had, and decided that the world owed her, at absolute minimum, the same dignity she was quietly giving the world in return. Clara Dobbins gave birth to a daughter in November of 1953. She named her Margaret, raised her largely alone, and by every account raised her beautifully. She worked at the Rio Grande 4 more years, saved carefully, trained as a bookkeeper, and eventually bought a small house in Tucson, with a garden her neighbours said she tended with the same unhurried care she had once given a room full of difficult strangers. She died in 1989, having outlived Thomas by 38 years, having carried her glass carefully every single day, and having never once let it spill. There is a kind of heroism that arrives in no dramatic fashion, that requires no camera, no applause, no grand stage to justify itself. It is the heroism of ordinary decency, exercised in ordinary spaces, on ordinary afternoons, when cruelty presents itself, and a person simply chooses, without fanfare or hesitation, to stand quietly in its way. John Wayne spent decades constructing one of the most enduring American images ever placed on a screen, the unhurried authority, the quiet strength, The man who does what needs doing because the doing itself is justification enough. What the story of Clara Dobbins and a Tucson diner in the summer of 1953 tells us is that the man behind that image was, in the moments that genuinely counted, entirely consistent with it, not because he was performing, but because somewhere along the road of his life he had simply become it. The question this story leaves behind is both simple and quietly demanding. How many of us, sitting in that diner, would have stayed in our seats? There is no judgment in the asking, only an honest invitation to sit with it, the way Ernesto Vega sat with it for the rest of his long life. If this story stirred something in you, drop a comment below and tell us what it brought up. Because the greatest stories are never merely the ones we watch. They are the ones that turn the mirror gently toward us and ask, in that quiet but firm way, who we are choosing to be. And that, perhaps, is the most enduringly American question of all.